Thank you, each of you, for joining us for our early morning coffee chat on information security and compliance. My name is Daniel. I am hosting this panel discussion, and I'd like to just take an opportunity for each of you to introduce yourselves. So, Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind, maybe brief introduction of yourself, what you're working on, what you're doing, what you're interested in. We'd love to know.
Great, thank you. Jimmy Tom, I am the AVP of Information Technology and Infrastructure at Financial Horizons, which is a mid-size financial services company north of the border. I'm basically the head of IT, and so I operate in the space whereby I oversee the all of IT operations, which includes security. I work very closely with our company's compliance operations, and happy to be here.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much. And Brandon, if you wouldn't mind giving a brief introduction yourself.
Yeah, I'm Branden Wagner. I do information security at Mercury, and that covers, everything from compliance programs like SOC 2 and PCI to, day-to-day intrusion detection, cybersecurity, protecting data, and making sure it's all where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, that doesn't sound too difficult. Brandon, I also want to acknowledge I'm aware you're a veteran, so thank you for your service. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Stas, maybe a brief introduction of yourself as well.
Sure. So I'm the CEO and founder of Compyl. We're an information security automation platform. We help companies do the right thing, figure out their compliance and security needs. In this ever more complicated and growing space.
There you go. Excellent. Well, the reason I asked the three of you to be on this call and have this discussion is I wanted to kind of pick through each of your brains and understand when it comes to establishing an information security program within an organization, early stages, or looking to improve an information security program, what that kind of looks like, what that process looks like, because I think I just hear very often in the community there's a lot of confusion on this. So Jimmy, if you wouldn't maybe mind starting us off here, I'm curious to know, in your mind, in your experience, some of the first things you think about for an organization when they're scaling and growing and they're beginning to think about really taking security and compliance a bit more serious.
Sure.
And yeah, how that goes.
So one thing about information security that I've often been challenged with throughout my career, regardless of where I've worked, is that the risks around what you're trying to protect is often very hard to quantify. And it's really getting to the point where you are able to convey to upper management, here's where we're at risk, here's where we need to protect ourselves, and here's what we need to invest in information security. Often it's kind of like selling an insurance policy, basically. How much do we need and what are the inherent risks? Nowadays it's a much easier environment just because, you hear on the news, CNN or New York Times or USA Today, where, company XYZ has gotten hacked and so forth. So the news is out there, but, often companies will sit back and think, well, what are the chances, can it happen to me? It'll happen to someone else before it happens to us. And there's always that sense of denial, that sense of disbelief, and so forth. So as an information security professional, you always hope that senior leadership will buy into the whole idea of having a robust program before it's too late, in essence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Brandon, when you think about kind of buy-in, I know you're at a growing company, and you were an early information security hire there. So buy-in is absolutely critical. I'm sure maybe something you face. How do you kind of deal with those obstacles, kind of get buy-in, get people to get on board with maybe handling security in a responsible way?
Easy. Start with why. Why am I here, right? Like, why do we need this program? Why are there risks? And, Jimmy touched on it, like you need to be able to communicate and quantify, which is sometimes difficult. But if you can't quantify it, qualify it, right? What is the risk and what does it mean if we don't do this? You know, if we don't encrypt our data, what's wrong with that? Like maybe this data doesn't need to be encrypted, maybe that data does, right? So, you know, start with the why, run through that exercise, talk about it, right? Don't just propose a plan. Like we need to do all these things, we need to spend all this money, I need all these tools put in place, because that doesn't mean anything. You need to be able to communicate the why you're doing these actions and what it's going to bring to the company and why are we protecting it. I mean, you may not care if everybody's emails get leaked, or you might. You might care that their credit card numbers get leaked, or you might not. But if you put all of those risks and all of that context there in front of them, you usually get pretty good buy-in, or you at least get a good discussion on why it's not important.
And how do you normally get, like, I'm just curious because like I have my own way of doing this, but like how do you guys get you know, you start asking the why, but then how do you actually get the answers to that? Like, again, how do you quantify or qualify what is important and what isn't important in your organizations? Like, often, like my experience with this space has been is, you know, I get hired as the CISO or whatever, and they're like, well, you know, we need to protect the organization, but we actually don't know where any of our stuff is or what, you know, where our crown jewels are or who's got access. Like, how do you just branching off on the why, sorry, Branden, back to you. Like how you've got the why, and then how do you actually get the what and the how and the when?
Yeah, so you know, first you talk about the why, which is great, but the what is the important thing, right?
Yeah.
You can't protect it if you don't know it exists, right? So you start with your asset inventory, and you need to have that discussion too. Like, what is an asset? You know, are we only talking about computers? Are we talking about data? Are we talking about people? You know, where do we draw the line between what's an asset? And then you start with asset discovery, whatever those assets might be, right? So then you build your asset inventory and you bring it to them, right? Like, here's what our assets are, and here's what it's going to cost to protect them. Well, if that asset's worth $5, your request for $50,000 to protect it is probably or should be denied. If they approve it, you should probably leave. But that's a different topic.
Yeah. How many times has that happened?
Yeah.
Never, to my knowledge.
Yeah.
Jimmy, I'm curious if you think part of this kind of discussion, and this is a great topic right now, but do you like when it comes to information security and getting buy-in, I believe that part of the challenge with buy-in is you're communicating something that it's not. I don't think it's that a C-suite doesn't care about. I think it's actually hard for them to understand it. How do you go about communicating in a way to actually get them to understand it? Because they can't care about it if they truly don't get it, right?
Yes, that's correct. So, you know, one thing about the C-suite is that it's often made out of very different individuals with very different backgrounds, different levels of understanding, different things that they care about, kind of thing. And so the one factor that really resonates across any C-suite that I've dealt with, and even boards that I've dealt with, are, you know, what is the possible loss to the business in terms of dollars? What is the reputational risk? And what I've tended to do myself, and each organization is very different. So I would say to the people, you know, watching this panel discussion, really know your environment, know how your C-suite operate. But I'll tend to do a lot of storytelling. You know, this is the example of where we might be at risk. The benefit to having so many cyber attacks broadcast in the news, that there's so many different examples to draw from. Hey, here's what XYZ company is undergoing. Here's how they got hacked. And here are the commonalities between what they've experienced and what we are experiencing right now in terms of our environment. Let's do something about it. I do find that really, how should I put it? Put the fear of God into the C-suite and then dial it back and then determine, okay, now that I have your attention, here's what we propose to do about it. And here's why investing $1 will save us $2. Like really speak in that type of language to really quantify it that way.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of what you're saying, is very valuable, and especially quantifying, right? Being able to quantify risk. Branden, I'll toss it back to you. How would you go about quantifying risk for your organization? What would that process look like?
So yeah, that's one of the hardest things in cybersecurity, right? Like, uh, there's two ways to look at it, right? So like, I put a protection in place, and I've blocked all of these attacks. I can talk to you about the number of attacks that have been blocked, but that doesn't mean they would have been successful in the first place. So I'm also looking at things that they didn't attack at all because that protection was in place. So I'm trying to quantify something that doesn't exist, which is essentially impossible. So you have to take a look at, what you have in front of you. So go back to your asset inventory, right? Like, if this device is compromised, what does that cost us? So then we, look at what kind of data is on that device, or who has access to that device. And if they were compromised, what would it look like? So sometimes it's not even about the quantification as much as it is the exercise, or like Jimmy put it, telling the story, right? I can't quantify the damage because it's an unknown, but I can walk through the story of all of this data has been put somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be. And what does that mean? Now we're all over the news. Customers have started pulling contracts. What the scenarios are that could happen as a result. But like, to put a dollar value to it is usually a very hard thing. I mean, even if you look at like Gartner reports, they try to quantify it. People have tried to say, the average breach costs 1.7 million, but that doesn't mean anything because it's relative to the company. I mean, if you look at some of them, like an Uber breach is not the same as, Joe's coffee shop down the street. They both had a data breach. One of them went out of business, right? So like, the average cost of a data breach doesn't mean anything. The quantification doesn't necessarily mean anything if it's not put in the proper context. So scenarios and storytelling are really the only way to illustrate those risks.
Stas, so, again, we're talking buy-in, we're talking about how to get buy-in. How do you approach, let's say, an executive team who, kind of looks at security as a cost center? In reality, you're putting preventative measures in place when security is working well. It's generally, it's quiet. You're not reporting on issues. But then an issue happens and security's maybe on the front end of everyone's mind. How do you kind of combat the idea that like security is a cost center, and when it's working well, it's really not, you're not hearing much about security issues?
Yeah, this is going back to Brendan's point, right? Like, it's really hard to quantify something that hasn't happened, right? And especially if it's one of those situations where, like, if something doesn't happen, they ask you what are you doing? If something does happen, they ask you what are you doing? So it's just really it's hard. This space is particularly hard to quantify. The way that I usually get buy-in is I set up I set up a risk management policy, just at a high level, just trying to quantify what the issues are within the organization. So if that's like reputational risk, loss of customers, financial loss, whatever is important to that particular organization, and then try and quantify the risk, story tell it, and get it in front of the C-suite. So at the very least, they're aware of the issues that are occurring in the organization. It's documented, it's dated, so that your job there from protecting yourself is there. But in terms of a cost center, security is often seen as a cost center. It's not a revenue generator. But with that's changing day in and day out. Like, the fact that CISOs are now on the board, and often included in a lot of the conversations that they weren't before. I think the it's starting to be seen as a differentiator rather than a cost center, in the sense that if you have strong security, then more customers are going to be willing to do business with you, especially depending on your type of business and what you do. But it's changing.
Yeah. That's interesting. Jimmy, I'm curious from your perspective. You have an organization that's maybe experiencing some growth, and but yet to hire a security position, right? So maybe they are up against some compliance requirements. Maybe there is a baseline level of security even without a security person in place, right? And let's just say this fictitious organization. So they start experiencing growth. They realize they need to get a more of a hold on security, more of a hold on compliance. So now they're hiring people. And as we know, CISO role is the fastest turnover of any C-level executive. How do you go from not having security in an organization, or having limited security with maybe some people that don't have a security background, and that transition period to your first security hire? What is that first security hire kind of looking to do in the early days to kind of like get a grip of what's really taking place in the organization?
Sure, great question. And my quick answer is that there is no quick answer to that, just because every organization will be very different. The one complication with cybersecurity and even compliance and whatnot, where it belongs is really a question of the organization. Where does the organization think cybersecurity belongs? Does it belong under IT? Does it belong under compliance? Is it its own practice? And so the organization really needs to sit back and do a lot of reflection on, where do we want this particular role to sit? What are our requirements, and what are the most pressing needs that this type of role needs to address? I could very quickly say, well, a lot of cybersecurity is about remediation. It's about incident response, and so therefore, you ought to look for someone who's more technical, who can delve into the cyber threats and deal with those accordingly. But on the other hand, you miss the big picture in terms of, well, then you're just firefighting. Then you're not looking at cybersecurity in a more proactive manner. So a lot really depends on what your organization is struggling with, what are the inherent risks, and what are some of the things that you can address readily with an in-house person. There are also outsourced services that you can purchase, where you can purchase SOC as a service, or compliance as a service, or all these various technologies that can help give you an edge as far as getting ahead of the cybersecurity game. So it really depends on the organization, the organizational makeup, even existing team complement. Do you have robust technical people who can do the remediation? And so therefore, all you have to do is now concentrate on the cyber risks and give direction on what needs to be done from an infrastructure standpoint.
Yeah, that's great. Branden, tossing it over to you. Security, best handled internally or leverage external resources? What do you think?
Personal opinion, I think it's always best handled internally, but there's some trade-offs with it, right? So nobody knows your company better than you. So having security internal, they're going to know the culture, they're going to know the people, they're going to know the systems. You can outsource that, but if you do, you need to make sure you draw those responsibilities clearly. I think a lot of people or companies, when they outsource it, they're like, oh, security is not my problem anymore. And that's in my opinion wrong. It's still your data, it's still your company, it's still your customer. So having that security in your company is the best from a cultural standpoint, from a growth standpoint. Like, knowing your company is the way to do it.
Yeah, interesting. Stas, on the flip side, here, I know with Compyl, right? I mean, where we act as the extension of a security team, and we try to make security really tangible and relatable. And so, organizations understand kind of where their thresholds are. I'm curious, how do you keep security on the forefront of an organization's mind, you know, as a service provider for these organizations?
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Branden, right? I mean, if you can keep it in house, that's the best way to do it. Unfortunately, with the lack of shortage and skills in this space, it's very hard to do that. And just kind of going off of Jimmy's point, like the firefighting aspect, if you can pass that off to a third party to deal with the firefighting aspect of it, that like we always encourage like our customers to take like if they want to hire a CISO or they want to hire an internal team, we encourage them to do that, because that like the outsourcing should be seen as an extension, not the be all and end all of the security team. So like the day-to-day stuff, sure, pass that off to a third party, but as long as there's somebody that's ultimately responsible for it on internally within the customer environment that oversees what the external third party is doing and helping them out, because this space is very it is very broad and very complex at the same time. So like you can to try and take advantage of everything that you can depending on the organization, right? Like information security folk are quite expensive. Not all organizations can afford to staff all internal, so they have to have a hybrid solution. But ultimately, there should be, as Branden was saying, like you can't just pass it off and just say, oh, it's somebody else's, it's somebody else's problem. That never works out well. So it's a trade-off. Like everything else, you have to understand what what your organization is looking to do and where the immediate pain points are and what the quick wins are. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to get away from the firefighting and focus on strategy. So whichever way you can do that, based on budgeting, resourcing, or based on budgets and your resourcing constraints, like you have to figure that out. But I would agree, if you can afford to do it all internal, you should do that. If you can't, then you should think about a hybrid model.
Cool. Jimmy, getting away from firefights, how does a security professional, a CISO, CTO, CSO, how do they, with limited resources, how do they move away from firefighting every day?
Again, a very good question. Again, it really depends on the organization and the internal resources. I'll echo what Branden was saying. Know the environment, know what the risks are, know what your capabilities are in terms of going beyond firefighting. Be able to anticipate what the risks are to the organization and how will you respond to it. Do you meet it head on and therefore expend resources to it? Do you basically just let the risk happen because the risk tolerance of the organization, will bear that risk, and therefore you have compensating controls that can deal with the risk, but also ensure that the damage is minimal. So a lot of it really depends on having that line of sight across the business, being connected with the various parts of the business in order to understand, okay, what does the lay of the land look like? How should we prepare ourselves? And what are some of the areas where we can potentially, I hate to say this, give way to a threat actor because we know it's fairly low risk. But on the other hand, our crown jewels are here. Let's spend all of our limited resources on this piece, and then the rest can be up for grabs because they are very low risk. And I think it goes back to really quantifying what the risk elements are. Risk is, I guess, typical model that I've used in the past is risk is impact and likelihood. So likelihood you can potentially predict from the standpoint of, well, how are other like organizations being hacked? What's my likelihood of being a target by a threat actor? And then impact, well, there are some ways of gathering that. What does it mean if the organization's down for a day, for an hour, for half a day? One thing I will mention, being a so-called jack of all trades, if you will, because my focus isn't just cybersecurity, but it's also all of IT. I also have a disaster recovery background, and one thing about DR and business continuity is that there's a business impact analysis that is inevitably developed as part of that process. And I often tell IT departments, hey, you know what, don't reinvent the wheel. Look to see what the organization already has in your catalog of resources. If you have a BIA, that might be a good resource to determine what is the impact to our organization. And so at that point, you don't have to quantify what does downtime look like for an hour, for half a day. At that point, you can build the case in determining, okay, now what is the likelihood that we can be compromised in such a way where that service is brought down for X amount of time. So to me, the CISO has to have good line of sight in all those elements in order to make the decision in the first place.
Interesting. Cool. One last topic I want to shine some light on is risk reporting. I think kind of what we're talking about here is the idea of establishing a program, but at some point that program has to be communicated, right? And getting it in some sort of repeatable, predictable format in terms of a report and sharing that with decision makers is going to be critical. So, Branden, how do you think about quantifying risk and some sort of consistent reports? Have you had much luck, much experience? Is this something you're working on? Is it something you find valuable, having risk reports part of a quarterly cadence, let's say?
Yeah, so risk reporting is one of the hardest parts of my job, right? Being able to make it clear to the various stakeholders what the risk is, what it means, and what's the impact of ignoring it. It does come down to targeting the right audience, and who owns that risk. That's sometimes the difficult part, right? Because if I'm talking to engineering about something, that it may be their responsibility, but it might also be the business side of it. So who owns the risk? Who's actually responsible for monitoring that or correcting that? Is it my job to fix that risk, or is it the sales team, or is it the engineering team, right? So reporting that to the right audience with the right impact, is this $5 fix worth it to prevent 5 minutes worth of downtime? Maybe, right? But it's going to delay all these other projects from going into place, or whatever that might be. So the risk reporting is really like, it has to be tailored for every audience, but in order to do that, you have to figure out who owns that risk.
Very cool.
I'm just curious. Can I just ask? Like, I don't know what your experience has been with both you guys, but like, did your organizations already have risk committees defined before you got there, from a security perspective?
From a security perspective, no. From like a business perspective, right? Like with various compliance or contracts or programs, yes.
They had something. Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I found that the two usually go hand in hand as well. So this is the financial risk, and there's usually an IT or cyber component to it.
Yeah, no, I found that as well. They, like, in my experience, there either isn't one or there is one, but they're having the same problems, whether that be tech risk or IT security risk. Like, they were still finding it hard to quantify even business risk, and being able to put a dollar figure across it. So I was just curious.
Stas, I know that risk reporting, big piece. I know you're pretty passionate about it from just being in this industry, building Compyl out, and I know risk reporting was something you wanted to be able to provide. I'm just curious, from your experience, let's call it in the field, risk reporting, and now kind of being able to put some comprehensive reports together fairly quickly. What kind of value do you see that providing to customers and that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, my experience with this is, working at large and small organizations, is the reporting is never, it's never been it's never been repeatable. It's never been automated. So always someone sends a spreadsheet around saying, "Can you fill in your KPI numbers here?" It's a finger in the air. You know, it goes out. A lot of people don't understand what it is that they're looking at. Like what I always try to do is to automate those type of things so that the reports are consistent. You can actually see, you know, quarter on quarter, and month on month, you know, progress or reduction in risk or whatever it is that you're trying to, you know, whatever it is that you're trying to convey to the business, but you're showing them, you know, this is the same report you're going to get every time. It's consistent. You can actually see, you know, where you're trending as an organization, and you know, the best part, if you can get it to this point where they can actually generate them themselves or actually drill down into the data to understand where their risks are. Most you know, organizations don't go to that level, or you might have one or two C-suite execs that do go into that level, but that data is really, really powerful. Also, from, you know, promoting yourself in your organization, just showing like, my department has done this, and like quarter on quarter we've reduced the risk, you know, from, you know, $1 million down to like 200,000. Like, this is all of the areas and all of the, you know, departments where we've seen the risk reduced, and this is what we've done. Like, being able to quantify that and show that to the business, I think is very, very powerful. I've never, you know, I've only, you know, I've seen that very few times in my life, and I've been doing this for a while. But it's basically, it makes, if you can do it well, it makes you and the department look good, and it's also very valuable to the business.
Yeah. And Jimmy, just curious, your experience with risk reporting, the value of it, or the ability to produce, you know, consistent reports. What does that look like?
Sure. So I guess my whole attitude towards reports in general are very favorable. And I'll quote the business author, Peter Drucker: "You can't manage what you can't measure." So just having that visibility is very key. Now, the one important thing is that you can't just give a bunch of metrics to executives, because, I mean, it's kind of like statistics. Statistics can be interpreted in so many different ways. Basically, control the narrative. Answer the question, so what? So every time you present something, be ready to answer the question, so what? Okay, here is what the numbers are telling us. This is what it means to us. And to Stas's point, this is what we're doing about it. So in effect, you're almost, again, putting the fear of God into the executive, but also illustrating, this is what we're doing about it. So everything is under control. Everything is well underway as far as our cybersecurity investments, and this is why it's been worthwhile to spend what we've been spending on cybersecurity, on compliance, and so forth. So really pushing that message across will really, number one, give the executive, the C-level, the reassurance that, yes, we are aware that there are risks out there, that they are very current. Yes, we do know that we are doing something about it. And yes, this person in this role is doing the job that we hired them to do, because they are keeping us safe.
Very good. That's well said. Well, I just want to say I am so appreciative of everyone's time here. This was a really healthy and great conversation. I think we're able to shed some light on you know, the way organizations should be thinking about either building or bolstering their current information security and compliance program. So thank each of you for your time today, and I hope we can all get together and chat again soon. Thanks again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.